today we are discussing country risk assessment. So again, hello everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us today. We do have Justine joining us as our guest speaker, and she gave a little bit of a bio history, and she was with the regulator and she has been in regulatory compliance, you said 20 years. And so with her extensive expertise in risk assessment and regulatory compliance, she's going to share with us today some key insights into how country risk ratings can be determined and their role in a kind of your comprehensive AML compliance framework. So I'll let her kind of share her agenda later, but before we do begin, a little bit of housekeeping. Just remember, this is not legal advice. This is just for informational and training purposes only. We try and stop right, at an hour. Don't waste your time. There will be certificates of attendance that for all of our live attendees. We do ask questions. There is a question box, so you can post your questions. We try to get to as many as we can. We have a pretty large audience today, so sometimes we can't get to all of them. Recording and slides will be made available to everyone who registered. So, and of course, we do have some additional topics coming up. And of course, there is a slide there at the end as well if you want to stay on and see those additional topics that are coming up. All right, Justine, I will let you go from here. I'm going to turn off my camera. You are welcome to turn yours off too if you would like. And I will turn mine back on at the very end. So go ahead, Justine. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Kimberly. Good morning, everyone. Today, I wanted to do this silo presentation. I'm actually quite excited to do the silo presentation on the topic of country risk assessment. I think that country risk assessments is one of those red-headed stepchild of an AML CFT framework. A lot of people take country risk for granted and they think, well, how difficult can it be? Just pluck a list from somewhere and here you go. We have a list of high-risk countries and we can just get on with our day. So I think it's really important to realize how fundamental country risk assessment is to your compliance program and also to enable you to have an effective AML CFT risk assessment in your business. So my agenda today, we're going to look through what it means to assess country risk. Why do we assess country risk, aside from the fact that probably your regulator or your regulations that govern you tell you you have to do it? Some best practices for country risk assessments, the use of online country risk lists, and I'm going to lead you through how to develop your own country risk assessment framework. It sounds very daunting, but it's actually very, very rewarding. So let's go through the first slide. What does it mean to carry out a country risk assessment? And even before you get to that point, what is country risk? So country risk refers to the risk of doing business either in another jurisdiction that's not your own jurisdiction or with persons from that other jurisdiction. Now, country risk depends on the context. We hear a lot about country risk in the case of finance, in the case of credit worthiness. We see, for example, credit risk rating agencies that will rate countries that issue bonds, and they look more at, for example, political risk or financial risk in any country that issues these bonds. But the concept of country risk can also be applied to financial crime. So when you look at country risk assessment for financial crime, you're looking at the social, political, and legislative conditions and events in a foreign jurisdiction that allow money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing to take place. Next slide, please. So one thing that's really, really important to understand is what is the source of country risk? Why are some countries more risky than others? And I see that, from the poll at the very beginning, when it was asked, what factors do you weigh in when you do your country risk assessment? And I was a little bit dismayed to see how few of you take into account economic instability. Right? So economic instability can give rise to increased criminality. And therefore, it increases the risk of money laundering and the risks of terrorist financing or proliferation financing. So that is one of the sources that would allow or that would elevate the risk of a country, that even relating to financial crime. Now, some other sources of country risk, why would a country be more risky to do business in from an AML CFT perspective, is of course the first one is the lack of AML CFT laws and regulations or weak AML CFT laws and regulations. And I think pretty much everyone kind of that's a very intuitive reason for country risk. The second one, again, something that we don't really talk a lot about, but it's the weak rule of law and weak judiciary. And so, what does it mean? Does it mean that there are persons in this jurisdiction who are above the law? Does it mean that anyone who contravenes the law is brought to justice? And there are some countries where you have, for example, politicians, where you might have important figures who think that they are above the law. And in those countries, you can see that there's an increased risk, for example, for corruption, for bribery, for organized criminality to flourish, and that in turn elevates AML CFT risks. The third element is when you have countries where you have high levels of corruption, bribery, or organized crime. So let's say even if you have the rule of law and you have a strong judiciary, sometimes you still see, in countries you see some corruption, you see bribery, you see organized criminality, and those countries again are countries where are the risk of money laundering and terrorist financing and proliferation financing is elevated. The next one, skipping down, is countries near conflict zones. So when you have countries that are, for example, near a zone where you have some civil unrest, where you have terrorist organizations that are active, these zones or these countries are more likely or easier to be misused by criminals, by terrorist financiers, and by those seeking to carry out proliferation financing activities. And then another factor is the geographical position of the country. So unfortunately, some countries in the world, and that's just how it is with with their geography, they are on a route where it's a known transshipment route for narcotics or illicit materials, or maybe even for human smuggling, right? So for example, if you think, in our position in the Caribbean, and if you think that the transshipment of drugs from South America to North America, which countries would be in the way of this transshipment? So, of course, these factors are not exhaustive. These are some factors that that would create a country that is higher risk for MLTF. But I think it's really important to acknowledge each one of these factors and not think that high risk countries for MLTF are only those countries that have weak or inexistent laws relating to the prevention of money laundering and terrorist financing. Now, it's really important to understand there is no universally agreed definition of a high-risk country. No one's come up yet with a single definition, a single way of kind of identifying those countries that are high risk. And there are many reasons for that. I mean, one is that its perception is in the eye of the beholder, right? So depending on what type of business you do, what your exposure is to these different countries, your risk will differ. So now that you know what are some of the sources of country risk, um, why is it important to know this? So I've just spent 3 minutes or talking about how you identify country risk or where country risk comes from. But why do you have to know? So one is, of course, that your regulator or the regulations that govern you probably tell you that you have to have a list of high-risk countries relating to money laundering and terrorist financing, right? But aside from that, um, you want to know your firm, you want to know your own risk as a firm so that you can protect yourself against nefarious activity. So if you have any parent companies, any subsidiaries, any offices in different countries, you are exposed to country risk. If you have any customers or your customers' beneficial owners are in other countries, you are exposed to country risk. If your firm facilitates any international transactions, if you rely on eligible introducers in other countries, or if you have relationships with suppliers, with outsourced service providers in other countries, you are exposed to a certain level of country risk. And in order for you to be able to protect yourself against the risks in these countries, first you have to assess those risks and know what you're faced with so that you can implement the proper mitigating measures. So next slide, please. So a proper risk assessment increases your understanding of risk within your business. It allows you to have a better entity-wide risk assessment. And this is really important because in most countries now, you have to have, in relation to your AML CFT program, an entity-wide risk assessment relating to money laundering, to terrorist financing, and to proliferation financing. And so it's really important to understand how country risk differs between these three types of financial crime. You need to understand country risk, as I mentioned before, so that you can implement the proper controls, so that you can assess the risk of your clients as well. The other regulatory issues that require you to know which countries are higher risk versus lower risk is that in some cases you can use, let's say, simplified due diligence when you're carrying out your customer due diligence process. If your counterparties or your clients or the beneficial owners are in a lower risk country, or conversely, some regulations require you to carry out enhanced due diligence when a client is located in a high risk jurisdiction. So you can't properly implement those regulatory requirements if you don't know which jurisdictions are low risk or which ones are high risk. Next slide, please. So some of the best practices for country risk assessment. First of all, as I alluded to in the previous slide, you have to have separate lists of high-risk countries for money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. You need to have 3 different risk assessments, and the profile of countries that, let's say, are high risk for terrorism financing might not necessarily be high risk for money laundering, or they might not necessarily be high risk for proliferation financing. So if you're using just one list for those 3 financial crimes, you are not carrying out an effective risk assessment of those 3 types of risk. The second is that you should have a written policy and procedure and methodology. How will you assess the risk of your country? What tools will you use? What instruments will you use? Who will develop this list? Who has to approve this list, etc. This procedure and methodology that you've put in place ideally will use more than one source. And we'll see in the following slides some of the common kind of pitfalls of using some popular sources. That doesn't mean that these sources shouldn't be used, it's just that they should not be used on your own. So most of you in the poll at the beginning indicated that you use more than one source, and that is an excellent practice. The next best practice is that you have to understand the country risk in the context of your business, right? So depending on what is it that you do or you engage in, some countries might carry more risk than others. So for your particular business, how does country risk affect you? Your risk assessment has to be kept up to date. And we had a polling question about that at the beginning. And some of you mentioned that you review your country risk annually. And I think Kimberly mentioned, I don't think in today's environment that is sufficiently frequent. Just to give you some examples, we have a lot of conflicts in the world. Conflict tend to start quite quickly, suddenly, and they have a huge impact. As you remember from a previous slide, being in a conflict zone or near a conflict zone increases your risk for certain financial crimes. And so when conflict develops, it has a material impact on the list of high-risk countries that you have. Now, so I think annually is probably not sufficiently frequent. Now, on the other hand, some of you mentioned that you update on an ad hoc basis, which is an excellent practice, but it might also be resource intensive. So, by all means, if you have if you have the resources, if you have the time, if you have the capacity to and the procedure to update it on an ad hoc basis, and it works for you, that's excellent. But maybe for some firms might struggle a little bit with that, especially smaller firms that have fewer compliance resources. So I would say kind of as a happy medium, if you update your list quarterly, I think that would be, quarterly, generally, and maybe ad hoc if, there is a significant world event. I think that would be acceptable. And finally, you have to verify the implementation of your list of high risk countries. It's no good having a list of high risk countries if nobody uses it. So if your, let's say, frontline team doesn't use it when they do customer onboarding, or your transaction monitoring team doesn't use the list of high risk countries when they do transaction monitorings, you might as well not have a list of high risk countries. So this verification of implementation, your AML CO might choose to do, for example, a thematic review of the use of the list within your jurisdiction, or maybe your periodic independent AML CFT audit will look at your use of those of your list of high risk jurisdictions. Okay,
Justine, I'm
excellent.
going to pause you right there. I've got a couple people, either due to their devices, they are having problems seeing the slides. I think it might help if you turned off your camera so only the slides show. For those who were having a problem, I think it might have been just a gallery view, but let's see if that does help those who were having, it's just a couple of you, but I just want to make sure that they could see the slides. Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. Okay, so as I mentioned, you can use online. So there's a lot of ready-made lists online, and it's very tempting to just go online, pick a list, use the list, and there you go. You have your list of high-risk countries. And don't do that. So online country risk can be useful, but you really have to understand the risks of using those lists, and and understand how they can actually be useful for you. So first of all, you have to understand the methodology behind the list. So you have to read through, how is the list created? What kind of criteria did it take into account? How often do they update it? What do they do if there's no data on a particular country? Some lists don't have the best methodology. So, for example, they're not updated frequently enough. They rely on only a couple of sources, etc. Ascertain the period of validity or updating frequency. Again, some country lists, even though they might be updated frequently, the data that they use, that they rely on, isn't updated as frequently, right? So they only rely on a couple of sources, and those sources are not updated. Then that list ceases to be valid, even though it might be updated for other countries. Take into account limitations of scope or subject matter. So we'll see a lot of lists don't take into account all three financial crimes, right? So money laundering, terrorist financing, proliferation financing. How do they deal with those issues? And then the other thing is the limitation scope is, as I mentioned at the very beginning, there's a list of reasons why a country would become a high risk jurisdiction. And so which ones of these reasons does it incorporate? Does it only rely on weaker AML CFT laws, which would not be a very robust list, or does it have other factors, scope factors, that it uses to assess the risk? Identify any conflicts of interest. So there are sometimes lists that are put out by organizations, even some large, like for example, charitable organizations in the world, and they have a particular view or particular agenda. And it's not to mean that these organizations don't do good work, but they sometimes when you see the list that they issue, these lists are very self-serving. And so you really have to understand who is the organization that publishes this list. And again, understand the methodology behind the list. So sometimes it might look like it's a bias. They might have a bias, but actually when you look at the methodology is quite sound. Therefore, the conflict of interest would be resolved. And then, as I keep mentioning, please don't rely on just one list, but use a curated variety of lists, and use a tool, an Excel spreadsheet, to put everything together and to figure out your list of high risk jurisdictions. So let's move on to the very first example of a ready-made list that is used a lot. So that is the FATF gray and black lists. And so you have on the screen here all the countries at this moment that are gray listed and blacklisted. And I do see quite a few people who take this list, and this is their list of high risk countries. And what is the problem with this approach? Next slide, please. So first of all, when you use the FATF gray list and blacklist, and this is nothing, just before I start, this is not to say FATF doesn't do an excellent job, but I think people misinterpret how the gray and black lists are issued. What are the conditions for a country to appear on this list? So I think it's not that the list it's not that the lists are not valid. It's that I think they are misused for a purpose that probably is not intended by FATF. So first of all, there is no distinction on these lists between money laundering risk, terrorist financing risk, and proliferation financing risk, right? When you look at the list of high risk countries, or list of countries on the gray list, I'm sorry, it does not tell you that certain countries, this is a weakness in money laundering, this is a weakness in terrorist financing, etc. Remember, and I'll repeat it throughout this presentation, you need three separate lists: money laundering, terrorist financing, proliferation financing, to do your three sets of entity-wide risk assessments. So the gray list and the black list don't tell you which of these lists each country should be on. Second of all is that the list is quickly outdated. So countries usually have a year or maybe a couple of years to move off of this gray list. And so sometimes they're on the gray list, then they'll be off the gray list. Does it mean that they've resolved everything? Does it mean that their AML CFT country risk is now less? It's not always the case. The list does not include smaller countries. So even if a country has very poor AML CFT controls, it might not make it on the gray list. So the gray list, the FATF prioritizes larger jurisdictions, or jurisdictions that have a larger what's called broad money. And I think it used to be 3 billion, now it's 5 billion. So smaller countries with really poor AML CFT controls would not make it on the gray list, even if they have very poor AML CFT controls, right? So another pitfall, of relying on this gray list is that you could be dealing with a small country that's quite risky, but that doesn't appear on the list. It doesn't capture all aspects of country risk. So for example, we spoke about corruption, we spoke about economic stability, we spoke about rule of law. FATF does not go into these factors when they assess countries. The countries on the gray list don't necessarily all pose MLTF or PF risk, right? So some of the countries are gray listed because they have some deficiencies within their AML CFT regime. But for example, you have some countries on the list that have no functioning financial system. They have no international links. Or very few international links. So it would be very difficult for persons in these countries to engage in a meaningful amount of money laundering or terrorism financing. They just don't have the infrastructure for that. And then finally, the progress of these countries is not updated until a country is off the gray list. So for example, if you have a country that is on the gray list, they have to report to FATF every 3 months on their progress. But FATF doesn't publish these progress reports, so you don't actually know that the country risk in that specific country is going down until the country is actually off the gray list. And then similarly, after the gray listing process, when the country is off the gray list, there's a few years before you see the next FATF or CFATF assessment. And in that period of time, you don't know what's going on in that country. That country could be doing great, or it could be doing not so great. So these are all the dangers of relying solely on the FATF list of gray listed countries and blacklisted countries to for your list of high risk jurisdictions. Okay, next slide, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out too, Justine, a couple of people have commented that your list obviously showed the Philippines on it. They say it has been removed, and Laos and Nepal have been added, if I'm seeing the comments correctly. So
Mhm.
again, just
Yeah.
a kind of a example of how sometimes these lists quickly get outdated. So, but thank you for the audience members who wanted to point that out.
Yes, exactly. Yes, and I think actually this was outdated. This new list just came into force. So when I was doing my slides last week, this was the gray list, and it just shows you how quickly things change because there was a FATF meeting last
Mm-hmm.
week. So the list would have been updated on Friday of last week, and I was done my slides by then. So yeah, you're
Yeah.
completely right. Yeah, yeah,
And congratulations to the Philippines. We all know what that feels like to finally come off the gray list. So,
yes. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the next list that people use often is the Basel Institute on Governance. And the Basel Institute on Governance takes a myriad, I mean, they take, a dozen or more indicators, and they weigh those indicators in order to assess the risk of a country in relation to money laundering. And so you see here an example of the list on the Basel Institute website. So what is the issues with using just the list of the Basel Institute? Next slide, please. So as the same as with the list of gray listed countries and blacklisted countries by FATF, there is no distinction on this list between money laundering, terrorism financing, and proliferation financing risk. When you look at the indicators that are used, like when you look at the methodology used by the Basel Institute, the methodology is heavily weighed towards money laundering risk. The progress is not updated because there is this reliance on the FATF results. So a big component of this list of who is ranked highly on this list is reliance on the FATF gray list and blacklist. So that is a little bit of a flaw in the sense of the FATF, the reliance on just the FATF gray list has its own issues. And so the Basel Institute's heavy reliance, I should say, on the gray and blacklist and FATF results is also an issue here. There is a lack of data in some surveys. So as I mentioned, the Basel Institute relies on more than a dozen different data points, and most of them are surveys or most of them are indices of country ratings on various, done by various international organizations. Now, some of these surveys are very specific. Let's say they only do the bigger countries, or they only do the poorer countries, or so when a country is not participating and cannot participate in some of these surveys, then they get punished, and these countries get a higher risk rating because of that. And that's kind of not very representative of the country risk. Similarly, with the gray and black list, the listed countries don't necessarily all pose actual MLTF risk because of their infrastructure, their lack of capacity, their lack of international links. And then, as I mentioned, there is a reliance on these other reports that have their own methodological problems. So you're kind of compounding the methodological issues in ready lists. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so then the next type of, or the next provider of online list is the Know Your Country list. And the Know Your Country, you can go on their website and you have both a free version and the upgraded version. So my comments that I will have on this tool relate mostly to the free version, and also relate to the kind of paid version, the more in-depth version, if you don't read through and make your own assessment. So next slide, please. So this, the Know Your Country tool provides risk ratings for both TF and ML. But again, there is no risk assessment for proliferation financing. Some of the concepts on that list are a little bit outdated. So, for example, the concept, well, is this country an offshore country? Offshore country, we know is not necessarily synonymous with higher MLTF risk. So this is, I find this to be a very broad brush. It relies on FATF lists, which again we saw the problem with the FATF lists. And again, if there is no data on a particular indicator, then the risk rating gets inflated. Next slide, please. Okay, and finally, my last the last set of limitations I wanted to point out relate to lists of equivalent jurisdictions. So in the poll at the beginning, some of you mentioned that you rely on the list of equivalent jurisdictions that are issued by your regulator. And we used to have a list of equivalent jurisdictions in the Cayman Islands. And it is not, unfortunately, a foolproof list. So, firstly, when you have a list of equivalent jurisdictions, and one of these jurisdictions, let's say, is gray listed, or there's something happening politically in that country or economically in that country that would increase the level of country risk, it is very difficult to remove a country. There's a lot of pushback from the country, especially if it's kind of in the if your country does a lot of business with that other jurisdiction. There's a lot of pushback. There's a lot of lobbying by industry because now they're going to have to do EDD on their clients, etc. So it's not always objective. Then the second issue, and this kind of related to the first issue, is that sometimes the decisions can be influenced by politics or business. So when we had the list of equivalent jurisdictions in the Cayman Islands, often industry would come and say, well, can you put this country on the list? And then when you assess the country, they're not nowhere near equivalent. But then you get a lot of lobbying, a lot of meetings, a lot of emails, either from industry or even from politicians because they want to, let's say, increase business with Brazil. So please, can we put Brazil on the list of equivalent jurisdictions? So then your list of equivalent jurisdictions for AML CFT kind of loses its meaning because it's influenced by factors that are not relating to MLTF country risk. The list of equivalent jurisdictions might not be updated sufficiently frequently. So the list, when we had a list in the Cayman Islands, there was quite a long process to either add or remove countries from a list. So let's say the war breaks out in country X. You say, okay, country X should probably be on this list. And then by the time, so you have to write this paper, you have to do your research, you have to get the paper approved. You have to, probably get the paper approved by the board. It's a few months before this list is updated. And then finally, the list does not indicate true equivalence in all sectors. So for example, there are some countries that have very good AML CFT regimes, but let's say they don't yet regulate lawyers for AML CFT, right? We know, for example, Australia just started regulating lawyers for AML CFT. And so if you say, well, okay, I'm going to put Australia on the list of equivalent jurisdiction, but you're actually dealing with a lawyer in Australia, that law is not equivalent. But when looking at this list of equivalent jurisdictions, you would never know that. Another example is in the Cayman Islands, when we had a list of equivalent jurisdictions. Obviously, the US was on this list, but mutual fund administrators in the US at the time were not regulated for AML CFT. So it was not. So I think there was pitfalls relying on this list for anything and everything, without thinking about, okay, where are the differences? Because difference doesn't mean, equivalent doesn't mean identical. So I think people use the list very blindly. They said, okay, here's a list I can rely on, and actually didn't see the risk that was in those jurisdictions.
Quick
Okay, so next,
question,
yeah,
Justine, if you don't mind.
yes.
Is there, which countries do you know of that do have, the regulators have issued equivalent jurisdictions list? Is there anybody still using those? I mean, any main countries, I should say, or any countries you know of?
I actually I don't know of any, but there might be some. Yeah, I'm not actually sure. But we did see at the beginning of the poll, so I don't know. Maybe somebody else can chime in the chat because we did see some in the poll that some people still relied on those lists.
Somebody's telling me Guernsey still issues an equivalent list.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if anybody in the UK, like people who are working in London or in England, if they have one. But yeah, somebody's saying Guernsey does.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, Isle of Man. Somebody's saying Isle of Man as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Somebody else is saying Mauritius previously used. Oh, but they repealed it. Okay, so Mauritius does not. Yeah, so it looks like Guernsey does, but Jersey does not. No
Yeah.
longer. Okay. Okay. Interesting. All right. Thank you for
Interesting.
those of you who did participate in that. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and I think it would be interesting to, if you want to, again, if you're curious, go to the methodology that your regulators published on how did they come up with this list of equivalent jurisdictions? Do they have any caveats, relating to the list, and how frequently is it updated, et cetera? And maybe even compare it to, when the new gray list comes out, how quickly changes are made, et cetera. And I think that will give you a good idea of, how much you can rely on this list.
Yeah. And somebody else says Jersey has a list of high risk jurisdictions. I'm
Yes.
wondering if that is just aligned with the FATF gray and blacklist or not. I haven't seen it lately. I know I have seen that list, but I don't know how much of it
Yeah,
aligns or if any extra countries added to it.
and I think the FATF, and I think this is a bit of a different, a little bit of like the flip side of the coin. I think the FATF looks more favorably on countries that issue lists of high risk jurisdictions rather than equivalent jurisdictions, because it's much more difficult, much more granular to do an equivalency comparison than it is to say, well, this country's high risk and give your reasons. So I do see quite a few countries that have lists of high risk jurisdictions. And I think again, even like if they use many sources or if there's a methodology to it, I actually think that's not a bad idea.
Yeah, they are saying that Jersey List uses a variety of sources which are provided for reference,
Mhm.
which is good. I guess the other question is what if you disagreed with that? But that could be at the end, so we'll carry on now. But thank you for responding to that.
Okay. So next, on the next slide, so so my, I personally with my clients, we don't use obviously a single list of high risk jurisdictions. Actually, I don't use any of the lists, the ready-made lists. I go straight to the source, right? The source of information, in order to kind of create my own country risk assessment. So I look at the FATF country risk assessment, so not the gray list, blacklist, but the actual assessment of the jurisdiction, the actual uh, mutual evaluation report. We look at the corruption perceptions index, the global terrorism index, any OFSI or OFAC sanctions lists, national risk assessments that countries issue on their own risk. And I also love the Royal United Security Institute in the UK. They do a lot of work on sanctions, a lot of work on proliferation financing. They issue really, really good assessments of country risks, even though it's not a list. You kind of have to read through their material, but they issue excellent, excellent materials. So so let's see how do these sources differ and how can they help you create a better country risk assessment. Next slide, please. So one of the tools that I think is really underused is looking at the FATF actual country risk as in the mutual evaluation report. So I have an example here. So as you know, the mutual evaluation reports are comprised of two parts. One is the technical compliance part and one is the effectiveness part. And they are divided, each technical compliance as well as effectiveness is divided into different topics. So I have here an excerpt of the mutual evaluation report of South Africa. And you can see where the weaknesses are and where the strengths of South Africa are. So, for example, so if you know about FATF, there's a 4-scale rating. So C is compliant, LC is largely compliant, PC is partially compliant, and NC is non-compliant. Right. So when you look at this as this mutual evaluation of South Africa in 2021, you see that, for example, in recommendation 5, which relates to terrorism financing, recommendation 6, which relates to targeted financial sanctions for terrorism financing, South Africa received a partially compliant and a non-compliant. And so at that time, you would say, well, actually, South Africa probably has a higher level of country risk relating to terrorist financing. You see that they also got a partly compliant on targeted financial sanctions related to proliferation financing. And again, probably a higher risk area here relating to proliferation financing. And then when you look at, for example, the offenses relating to money laundering, it's largely compliant, customer due diligence partly compliant, record keeping largely compliant, etc. And then you can make an assessment of the money laundering risk as well in this jurisdiction. Now, this is really good because with these results, South Africa does have to provide updates. So they have to submit follow-up reports, and they ask for upgrades. And so then you can see on the FATF website when a country's been upgraded. So it gives you kind of like the latest position of that country. So we probably, because South Africa's mutual evaluation was 2021, we probably have seen already that South Africa probably upgraded all of the areas that they were non-compliant to probably largely compliant. And you can verify that on the FATF website. So if you use this kind of tool, it allows you to have a much more granular view of the risk in a country. Next slide, please. Okay, so the other example I mentioned that is a primary source of information is the national risk assessment published by countries. The Cayman Islands published a national risk assessment, the UK, Bermuda, etc., etc. And most often they will have national risk assessments for money laundering and terrorism financing, and sometimes for proliferation financing. So, for example, and this on the screen, you have an example of the terrorism financing risk assessment in Jersey. And you see that Jersey has rated itself as medium-low on their risk for terrorism financing. So this is, again, a source you can use to assess countries' risk on ML, TF, and PF. Next slide, please. And then finally, I have an example of something that RUSI published. So RUSI published a paper on sanctions evasion by North Korea. So North Korea is proliferation financing sanctions, and you see which countries facilitate or enable North Korea to evade sanctions relating to proliferation financing. And you see then your list of high-risk countries for proliferation financing would probably include the countries on this list, which would be China, Hong Kong, Russia, Singapore, Zambia, etc. And these countries are not typically countries that we would see on a high-risk jurisdictions list for, let's say, money laundering, right? So again, different purpose for different lists. Next slide, please. So what are the advantages of not relying on a ready-made list? What are the advantages of creating your own risk assessment, your country risk assessment framework? So first of all, you can make it bespoke to your business, right? Let's say you're a law firm and you deal with other law firms, or you're, a TCSP and you deal mostly in the trust sector or in the corporate sector. You can really make those country risk assessments bespoke to your business by looking at the country risk from the angle with which you do business with that country. You avoid the methodological flaws of ready-made lists. It can be very cost effective. So for example, the Know Your Country, the in-depth reports, the in-depth or the professional Basel report also costs money. You can make your country risk assessment your own without spending any money. It can be as easy or as complex as your business needs. So you can make a very simple one on an Excel spreadsheet with just check marks. Or you can, and we'll see a little bit later, you can do weightings, you can do conditional scorings, etc. And then also it prevents kind of inconsistencies between different data sources. So how do you do this? How do you create your own methodology? So you have to look at, you have to write this policy and procedure, as I mentioned in the beginning, and you say, okay, which sources of information will I use? So they can be primary sources like national risk assessments of a country or the FATF mutual evaluation reports, or they can also be, in combination with, for example, the FATF gray list or the know your country list. What methodology will I use? And so the methodology is how will you take all of this information and put it together to come up with a risk rating? Who's going to approve the methodology? So there should be kind of a reviewer to just fact check, do a sense check, does this work? How often will the list be updated? And who is responsible for updating the list, ensuring that the list is disseminated to all the staff, it's centrally available, and it's incorporated into your risk rating systems. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I see sometimes people do is that they have a list of all of the countries in the world and they try to risk rate every country in the world. And I think that's not very an efficient use of time. And I think you can't be very granular when you carry out that kind of exercise. So I think it's a good idea to kind of narrow down what countries do you really need to assess. So identify all of the countries that you deal with. Where do you have owners, subsidiaries, affiliates, where your clients are from, where they reside, where the beneficial owners of your clients are from or reside, the activities or transactions that take place, where do transactions come from, go to, and then where are your service providers or eligible introducers located. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, so you would divide your sources of information into those that you would use to assess money laundering risk, terrorism financing risk, and proliferation financing risk. Pick a scoring system. It can be on a scale of 1 to 5, or it can be low, medium, high. With each source of information that you have to have a methodology of how you will score each source. So for example, if you use the Basel Index, you'll say, okay, well, the top 20 countries in the Basel Index will automatically, get this high risk rating for this particular source. Or, if it's a list that goes from good to poor, the bottom 20 countries would be high risk. If you're using primary sources, you can say, for example, a country that has more than 3 partly compliance on the mutual valuation report will be higher risk for money laundering, etc. You weigh each source. I think primary sources should carry more weight. So, for example, mutual evaluation reports, national risk assessments, etc. You should have a methodology to adjust if there's no mention of a country. So, for example, if you pick something like the Corruption Perceptions Index as one of your sources, not all countries in the world are mentioned in that list. So what happens if a country is not mentioned? You don't want to penalize a country for not being on the list. So that means that probably you're going to distribute the weightings differently. And then you determine the boundaries for each aggregate risk rating. So again, if you score on, like, let's say level from 1 to 5 or 1 to 3, and then you do your weightings, your calculations, what is a low? Is it from 1 to 2? Is it 1 to 1.5, etc.? Next slide, please. So if you want to go low tech, which is completely possible, you have all your scoring categories and all your weightings into an Excel spreadsheet. And then you would calculate the score for each country on each factor. And if you choose to use weighted factors, you multiply it by the weights and you add up all the scores. If you don't use the weightings, then you can just say, okay, well, if they have 2 or more ticks, then they're considered like, so let's say if they feature on 2 or more they have 2 or more high risks on my sheet, then they are high risk, etc. And then you can assign the risk rating for your country. So next slide. So this is an example of how you can put all of this together. And this is, for example, an assessment of money laundering risk for a country A. So we have our factors are economic stability, political stability, FATF mutual evaluation report, corruption perception index, national risk assessment, and the INSCR report from the United States. So on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being low risk and 5 being high risk, you can see that this country is fairly economically stable. They have a moderate degree of political instability. They have a terrible FATF mutual evaluation report. They're quite, they have rated quite risky or quite, high perception of corruption in the country. They rate themselves as moderate risk in their national risk assessment, and then the INSCR gives them a high money laundering risk rating. So, and I have put weights, and of course these weights, you can put in the weightings, the way that works for you, and the sources that you use. And then you see that their score total is 3.7 on a scale of 1 to 5. And then you see how I set up my boundaries between low, medium, high. I did it so that each band is the same amount of points, but you can also do it that maybe your low and high categories will be a little bit smaller and your medium category will be a little bit larger. That is fine to do from a methodological perspective as well. And so you see that a score from 3.7 would put this country into a higher risk bucket. Now, you can make this a little bit more complicated. So, for example, I gave 20% weightings to the country's self-assessment. So, national risk assessment, they weighted themselves moderate, and I put 20% weighting in that. But let's say you can look at their FATF mutual evaluation report and see, does FATF think that they do a good job with their country risk assessment? If they get a good risk or good rating on FATF, on their methodology, then maybe you add more weighting to their national risk assessment. Or if FATF thinks they do a poor job, then you can maybe take off the weightings here and put more weightings on the FATF side. So you can do kind of this more complicated conditional uh, calculation as well. So as I said, it can be as easy or as complex as you want to make it. Next slide, please. So finally, what I want you to remember from this presentation, so country risk assessment is fundamental to having a solid entity-wide risk assessment for each of money laundering, terrorism financing, and proliferation financing risks. The way you do country risk assessment should be part of a policy and a procedure. How do you do this? How often is it reviewed? Who is responsible? And how do you make sure it is implemented? Separate lists for ML, TF, and PF. If you use online lists, make sure you understand the limitations of them and how do you mitigate those limitations. So maybe if one list doesn't have PF, maybe you'd have to use another source to make sure that you have the full coverage of ML, TF, PF risks. And then you can create your own risk assessment methodology using primary sources or a mix of sources. And that is the end of my presentation. Any questions?
Sorry, I wanted, thank you if you can hear me. Sorry. Thank you, Justine. I appreciate that. A few questions. And first of all, lots of people are giving hands up and thumbs ups, thanking you as well. We do have about 4 or 5 more minutes. I wanted to kind of pick some of these questions because we have some very good questions. Now, you mentioned the FATF. Now, I have used the FATF's consolidated report where it has the, non-compliant, and
Yes.
it's now split into technical compliance and intended outcomes.
Yes.
So I do, whenever I'm doing mine, I kind of, that's my starting point. And
Mm-hmm.
as you kind of mentioned, I might put a little bit more weight on intended outcomes versus just technical compliance. And so I did have, so sorry, this is a former regulator himself who has mentioned use of the 11 effectiveness ratings in the mutual evaluation report provides a greater insight into a country's vulnerability to money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. So it sounds like he kind of is also saying use those intended outcomes as well in that. And I just kind of wanted to point that out as well.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that's a very good observation. I mean, personally, I'd probably use kind of a mix of the two. Because if there are serious, I mean, usually if there are very serious kind of legislative deficiencies, they might translate into the immediate outcomes. But yeah, immediate outcomes also great. There's 11 of them split. There's a separate one for terrorism financing, separate one for proliferation financing. So again, you'd get the data that you're looking for.
yeah. Let me see. There was a couple other questions. I'm trying to find them now. See, there was one. Of course, I'm sure what everybody's thinking, I'm going to answer this, is what if you don't have the time? And again, when you get into it, it's actually, you pick your list. And like I said, I always start with the FATF it's the FATF consolidated report of mutual
Mm-hmm.
evaluation. There's a few still missing that aren't on those, but of course, if you don't have any clients in those jurisdictions, just, don't worry about it. I
Yes,
did
exactly.
also really like the fact that you say make sure it's implemented. I do know of people who are still using, like, they'll use a standard spreadsheet that everybody
Mm-hmm.
probably saves and reuses over and over and over again. And there might be some kind of, algorithm, based on what country. So
Mm-hmm.
you do have to make sure it is implemented in that system. And whenever I'm working with our clients and we do any kind of risk score change to a particular country, we also do what's called a impact assessment, letting them know, hey,
Mm-hmm.
this is going to be impacting these profiles or these clients, and you're going to have to go back in and make those decisions.
Yes.
Somebody else was asking a question. Do you take the same approach for small structures like a small investment advisor? Um, and I would think so, but of course they might
Yes.
just be dealing with, people in a certain jurisdiction. Like I know, some Cayman asset managers and wealth advisors, they're dealing only with like UK, Canada,
Mm-hmm.
in US clients. Um, so you don't have to go through everything unless it just kind of pops up. So I think those are a little bit
Yeah.
easier.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I would only focus on the countries that you actually have business in, or that you have links to, or your clients have links to.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, just trying to go through some more of these questions real quick. Um, see, yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to get through some of these
Okay.
questions that I had highlighted. And I want to thank those who were sharing about the Philippines and the Jersey list. If I bet if you Google Jersey, was it high risk countries, you could find that. Somebody had posted a link, but I can't see it now. Okay. Okay. So somebody was also asking. I'm just going to read it. Somebody's asking, should I also assess the country risk of broker intermediaries, especially when they provide significant amounts of business to financial institution? I think yes. What would you say to
Yes.
that? Yeah.
Yes. I mean,
Uh,
I think if it's material, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I've even seen a regulator, and I think it was Jersey. They on their annual questionnaire, they were asking the regulated business to provide information on ref, the referrers of business,
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Yes.
and where they were from and what country they were from. So, and I've been telling our clients, I think it's something we need to kind of keep track of because I can imagine somebody else, another regulator, coming in and asking some of those same
Mm-hmm.
questions. Um, and there was another one. Let me see. Somebody's asking, what are your thoughts on the recent pause of the FCPA enforcement by the U.S. administration? Sorry, I'm not familiar with.
The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
Oh,
Well,
yes.
yeah,
Sorry. That,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah. What are your
I
thoughts
mean,
on that?
I think we're going to have to see how it plays out,
Mhm,
in the court system in the U.S. and what ultimately comes out. I think,
mhm,
unfortunately, the U.S. is in a huge state of flux right now, and a lot of uncertainty. I think a lot of what's happening too is might not necessarily be quite kind of final. There's a lot of pronouncements, but maybe no real change to legislation yet, like financial service legislation or anti-corruption legislation. But definitely something to be watched, you know. And we always think, well, the U.S. is an equivalent jurisdiction, but in many cases they're actually not.
Yeah.
And so I think, and this, you know, so I think you have to be really careful and look at it from like the perspective of your business in the U.S. Like some businesses will be, you know, like banking, like very strong regulations, but when you think, for example, of, you know, beneficial ownership, transparency, CDD in the case of like company managers or company formation agents, when you can, you know, open a company without providing any CDD in some states, because it might also be state dependent. So yeah, I think and that's why I think, you know, you really need to do an assessment.
Yes, and I would agree with that. I'm definitely seeing more of that as more states kind of roll out some new, you know, regs themselves. Um, by the state, it was like Wyoming, Nevada. Some of these states are, to me, a little bit more higher risk than other states.
Hmm.
The other thing I would, as we're, you know, everybody's trying, like I said, there's no definition of high risk, and of course the sources are kind of out there. What about if you change your methodology of risk assessing? If you go, wait a second, last year we didn't use this list, this year we are. Do you need to, and I would think the answer to this would be yes, kind of document your reasoning for this change in policies and procedures? Obviously, get your, you know, board
Yes.
senior management to sign off on that. Um, but maybe document in your policies and procedures why you made a change in a certain year.
Yeah,
Maybe.
I think that's good. Yeah, I think that's very good for posterity, because then you'll know, you know, if the change not working, then you know you're going to reverse this, or maybe you want to do more of, you know, what you've changed. And yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
And have you seen any regulators say, well, when you made that change, how many of your clients went from high risk to medium risk? Are they kind of digging down into that kind of um, you know it's those kind of questions?
I think, you know, well, yes and no. So yes, regulators will ask. So for example, if a country is now high risk, and you have clients from that country. So for example, a country becomes high risk because they've been on the gray list, or because, you know, they they self-assess themselves as high risk for terrorism, or whatever the case may be. I think the regulator will want to know that you've gone back to the clients, like to the client risk assessment of those clients that are in that country or from that country. But I think
Okay.
if you do just like a change to your methodology, I think that's more of a, okay, you document that from the next time that you do a periodic review of your clients, you will use the new risk assessment.
Okay. And for those who work for, much larger institutions where you have, different business lines, business units, I mean, when you do your business risk assessment, you're going to have risk rated, certain business lines or products that you sell. Have
Yes.
you seen any instances where the organization might actually have different risk, country risk ratings for a client in this business unit A versus business unit B, for instance? Have you seen any of
Yeah,
that, or do they
absolutely.
kind of roll it out
No,
all over?
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I mean, because it depends, you know, it depends on the counterparty. So, like, one of the examples I gave was, for example, like the fund administration space, right? So, if you have, you know, in the case of funds, if you look at investors from some jurisdictions, they might be kind of lower jurisdictions from the point of view of investors, but because this other country doesn't, let's say, regulate fund administrators, then from the point of where the fund administrator is located, they would be in a higher risk jurisdiction.
Okay, great. Sorry, there were a few other questions, but we're running out of time. We've gone over already. Um, so again, Justine, thank you so much for your time. If anybody wants to reach out to Justine, please do so. And of course, Tom here for Silo. And you guys are doing some advanced AML training in May
Yes.
13th
Yes.
in Cayman in person at the Yacht Club in Georgetown. So
Hmm.
here's some information here. It is also a handout. Sorry, I forgot to mention at the beginning. There is also a handout about that. And this is really good. I love the fact that you're going over these laws and regulations and these case studies. I'm going to assume you're also going to be talking about the regime, the SAR regime change with the Defense Against Money Laundering regime now. Um,
Yes, definitely. Yes, hot
the,
topic.
I'm sure that's a very hot topic right now. So yeah, more information here, and of course, you can email Justine or Corinna there. I'm going to be hosting one also in May the day after, but it is virtual, and it is more just AML awareness. So it's for anybody who needs that as well. So again, thank you very much. And I forgot to add the slide with future topics, but we do have more topics. Tom, did you want to? When's our next one? Sorry, I usually have a slide showing our next one, but I must have forgotten it.
Hi, Kim. Our next session is next Thursday, actually, and it's FATCA and CRS.
Ah, awesome. So anybody who has any
Yep.
kind of FATCA CRS filing obligations, please do join us. I do know that it impacts a lot of you, and the data you collect for AML for due diligence is used for FATCA and CRS as well. Um, so yeah, so please do join us for that. So I didn't realize that was next week, but you're right, it is. So fantastic. Thank you again for joining us. I want to again welcome those of you who joined us for the very first time. I hope you enjoyed it today. Justine, thank you as well. Again, all of
Thank
our guests, we do not pay them, they do not pay us. This is their free time, or they're giving their information to us free, and they're spending this time for us free to kind of help the industry. So this really is a great community. I do hope all of you join us again. You will get certificates for those of you who join live in your, and the recording will go out as well. Those certificates will be in your inbox probably in about an hour. We are also asking you to respond to a survey. It's just got a few questions. I think there's like 10 questions in it. Please do take some time and answer that survey. It does help us kind of understand what's common practice and also understand, get your feedback and see what other topics you would like us to present to you in the future. So again, thank you very much, and I hope everyone has a great day. And Justine, Thomas, thank you for your help today.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.